Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Dissecting Fiction podcast. I'm Vinny Murphy.
I'm Christian Cutlick.
Today, we're going to talk about something we're going to call the new Disney decade. As some of you may know, famously, Michael Eisner referred to the 90s, really 88 to 99, as the Disney decade, this idea of rebuilding the brand after some slowdown. And I think there are some absolutely incomparable successes in that Disney decade. That's where you get Little Mermaid, Aladdin, Lion King, Beauty and the Beast, that whole run of very successful animated films. By the time we get to the year 2000, things aren't so great. There is some success with a partnership that Disney has through Pixar, but by, I would say, maybe 2001, 2002, things have really slowed down.
It's complicated because in this era, after 2001, really after Lilo and Stitch, a lot of the old guard from the 80s and 90s left Disney to go on to other projects. That's a whole other series in of itself. And it was mostly due to DreamWorks rising up as a competing animation studio and kind of funneling talent away from Disney.
Yeah, and they have the huge success of the now almost 20-year-old Shrek, which is mind-blowing to me.
I still watch that now. It's like Shrek changed the game so much, though.
Yeah, it really did. It added that sort of a little bit of attitude that is funny because really what Shrek was making fun of was Disney. So Disney being able to retort was a little difficult. So this 3D animation style really starts to take over. Disney's having a lot of success with it, paired with Pixar. Disney announces in 2004 that their last traditionally animated film is going to be Home on the Range, and it's not really well received. Neither this announcement nor the film.
If you haven't seen on Home on the Range, don't. It's really, it's not good. There's nothing like really entertaining about it. This is also due to like rising animation costs, and because Home on the Range flopped so hard, they decided to transition to 3D. And they would do 3D with Chicken Little for their first 3D animated film.
Yeah, and this starts to cause some real difficulty within the company. A lot of people are calling for the resignation of Michael Eisner, someone who had saved the company in decades prior. This leads to Bob Iger taking over as CEO of the company in 2005. A pretty well-liked decision internally and externally. And also, Iger was no new part to Eisner's machine. I think Eisner ends up the sacrificial lamb here.
We'll probably do a whole other episode on this, but the short of it is that there was a kind of a coup within Disney, and it left a lot of projects rotting within Disney and just like sinking money out of the company.
Right, and Iger takes over, and what Iger also does is, after Pixar's about to leave, and I mean, they really were. Disney was about to move ahead on their own with sequels to Toy Story, Bug's Life, a bunch of the properties that Pixar had worked with them. He does eventually buy the company for around $7 billion. And this is kind of seen as a fresh start. This all is taking place in around 2007. So by 2007, you figure we're really looking at 2009, 2010 pretty heavily already.
Right. They also let John Lasseter come within the company and kind of reorganize the entire animation studios and everything, and he kind of put hard borders between each of the different divisions, so there wasn't much overlap.
Yeah, and there's going to be a little bit of change to that as time goes on, but it's something that we're really focusing on for this episode because we now have, once again, a very reestablished Walt Disney Studios animation. They're here. And the first thing we kind of see out of the Iger regime is something that is not in 3D, even though they said it was going to be, as 2009's The Princess and the Frog. That's written and directed by Ron Clements and John Musker, a sort of all-star team from the past. They had worked on Little Mermaid, Aladdin, Hercules, and with music from Randy Newman, which is a little bit of that Pixar influence, I think.
Princess and the Frog was kind of like a weird entry within the Disney canon because it's the last gasp of traditionally animated films within the feature animation studios. Like we said earlier, Home on the Range was supposed to be the last animated film, but John Lasseter, when he reorganized the studios, decided to give it one more try. The film itself is kind of strange in that I think it was a victim of his own marketing, and I don't think it's a bad film at all. But the way it was marketed, it was kind of like a mystery. It was kind of a weird mystery box trailer where they were kind of showing it like a reimagining of the traditional Princess of the Frog fairy tale, and I think that turned off a lot of people from seeing it.
Yeah, there was a lot of that going around. I think it's something that dies a little quickly. I think there's going to be a couple of exceptions to that going forward. But there was all of this chatter about this sort of making contemporary stories in the period where Disney was a little lost. And I think this might have been sort of the last result. Not to misframe this entirely, like The Princess and the Frog wasn't a bomb. Like, it made money. It just wasn't the type of success and the type of cultural touchstone that Disney always strives for. And I think that is kind of why putting those flagship Disney movies into traditional animation went away.
Yeah, no, I agree. They were looking for something like The Little Mermaid or Beauty and the Beast or what they have now with Frozen. And I think they were just setting their hopes way too high with it.
Like I said, it's not a complete failure. It makes money, and it's pretty well reviewed. It's just, it doesn't do what it was supposed to do, which is bring them back to this Disney Renaissance state of that late 80s, early 90s. And it's so clear that that's what the plan was, that it's why it gets thrown to the side. I can't imagine there's any other reason. So we end 2009, we end that first decade of the 21st century with not a failure, but, not the image Disney is trying to project. In 2010, we get Tangled, directed by Nathan Greno and Byron Howard, and written by Dan Fogelman. This has one of the more interesting histories because I think in a lot of ways, the progression of Tangled is the progression of the studio going into that new decade. It first kind of pops up in the late 90s as another of the fantasy Disney films that were, what they were making at the time. You're coming off of the big era going into the late 90s where you have still pretty prominent films like Mulan, like Hercules, like Tarzan, successful movies. Rapunzel was another one that was thrown out there as a story they could adapt. In 2001, they start moving forward on it. Eisner makes the call at that point to try to get it as a CG film. And these early versions of the script going through 2001, 2002, 2003 are all very targeted towards that sort of Shrek idea. It's going to be a goof.
I wouldn't describe Tangled as a goof.
But that's sort of light parody. Like, they're parodying themselves. Like, the film was going to be called Rapunzel Unbraided at that point.
Oh, that's what you mean, because because Shrek is very much like a satire. I do agree with that.
Right.
I think you see it more clearly in like Moana. They have a lot of that here too. There's a lot of like self-referential material within this new Disney era, and that was born a lot out of Shrek.
I think it's born out of Shrek, and I think it's also just born out of the general culture that now, because everything is so accessible, it's easier for people to not think about it and have someone show them how many like tropes really are through these films. Before, people just used to more enjoy it. I think it's an adaptation. I think you have to kind of acknowledge what's going on in the films. But it sounds like at one point, Tangled was almost going to be mocking the Disney brand. And I think that would have been a mistake. And that version of the film really gets shut down around 2006. Like, they kind of already go, hey, this is not what we want to do with the brand. We don't want to insult ourselves as we're making these films. And I don't think there's any reason to believe that's not in correlation with Iger taking over. Going forward, you get the announcement that it's kind of working back up in 2007. 2008, they're going through a lot of changes in writers and directors. And it's from that point that we really do get the movie that we were going to get. They make a really important decision at this stage, though. And it's something that Glenn Keane, who had been working on the film and had to step down due to some health issues, was a big proponent of. and I think it's something extremely important going forward into this decade. Keen made this decision that they had to conform to the Disney aesthetic, meaning that type of design that was going on throughout all of the Disney animated feature films was not going to be dropped in 3D. They had to find a way to take these characters and make them that malleable and keep that type of imagery. To me, that's one of the biggest decisions that they make for this production, because I think it kind of saves the Disney brand, like that fantasy brand.
It's interesting that you said when they were going to try to make this more of a parody, because they did kind of do that early on with films like Emperor's New Groove and even Lilo with Stitch to an extent, where Lilo and Stitch was a very kind of, I don't want to say edgy, but Stitch was always portrayed as like this little mischief character that was causing havoc within the Disney brand. And
Right.
I think Iger pulling pretty hard away from that was kind of him recognizing that Disney has an identity. They don't need to kind of copy DreamWorks or even make fun of themselves. People do like this brand, but they do have to be a little bit self-aware about it.
Right. I think self-awareness is different than mocking it, and that's certainly what we get with Tangled. Tangled is funny, but it's funny in a way that feels right to the type of story it's telling. And even if there, is a reference to something, it's going to be never overwhelming in these flagship Disney films. And this Tangled establishes that these flagship films exist again.
Right. I even think like it also deals more with like darker emotions too, because there's a very big storyline about like kind of like parental abuse and everything within this film. But there is also a lot of comedy in it, just with like Maximilian and Eugene fighting over each other, which I think takes a lot of cues from Lilo and Stitch in of itself. Or even like making fun of like how many animal sidekicks are within the film and all these other things. And I think this is where Disney really finds their identity within the new Disney era. And even like you said earlier about the animation style too, like a lot of this animation style really extends up into Frozen 1 and 2, which we'll get when we get into that, we'll talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what is also something that's really cool about maintaining like a very similar style of design is, now when you go to a Disney park or you're going to purchase a product that features more than one character, no one's going to look wrong. Like you can put Snow White pretty close to Rapunzel and Tangled, and it's not going to be off-putting. There's specifically a moment where that happens again, we'll get to, but Tangled is a very big success, which gets, I think, a little buried in history now, and really does bring back this confidence to Disney animation.
Yeah, I would say confidence, but again, people were still kind of unsure about what was going on because Disney was making a lot of big moves around this time too, just with like Marvel and everything as well. And I think a lot of people were looking at Marvel as the future of Disney and not really looking at their feature film department in this time period.
Yeah, I would agree. It's, at this point, I don't think any of us really knew what was going on, but it certainly, I don't know. Once I saw Tangled, I felt like things were going to be okay. And that's true. Like, I really enjoyed Tangled. I think it's very underrated. And, this happens a lot with Disney films. I think it's something we'll talk about at the end of the podcast, too, where I think it's a little underrated, but there's always a silver lining. In 2011, we actually get another arguably traditionally animated film, Winnie the Pooh. There was a lot of debate over the style on this. Supposedly they were going to do something really special, and it kind of didn't happen. Directed by Stephen J. Anderson and Don Hall. Winnie the Pooh is a really solid film, high quality. Unfortunately, it opens up against Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 2, and for all intents and purposes, bombs.
I guess this is trying to revive the Winnie the Pooh brand, which, is always kind of a weird limbo, much like the Muppets, but has more life than the Muppets for Disney.
We'll see, though, with the Muppets argument. That's something that we could definitely get into at some point.
But again, this is kind of like, it's weird seeing Disney occasionally go back to these like traditional animated films, because it kind of feels like this was supposed to be like a TV movie, and it just kind of happened to become like a feature film, much like how Toy Story 2 just happened to become a feature film.
I can speak to that a little bit. I actually, I find the development of this movie like really interesting. it was intended to be even more of an anthology than it ends up. I think they wanted to do something really respectful of A.A. Milne's stories and something that is kind of timeless. And once again, this is an idea we're going to revisit a little bit more later, but a failure from Disney isn't a failure like it is for other companies. I think there's value in Winnie the Pooh existing, and I think they knew that. I think they made a terrible decision of when to open it, but it's a good film. It's fun, and it is really pretty. It's just, it was not an overwhelming success.
It's hard. I think even if this didn't come out against Harry Potter, it would not have done super well. The audience it is geared towards is a lot younger, just in general, and I think even the anthology aspect would have turned off a lot of like moviegoers from it.
It's interesting. It's one of those things where, like sitting here second guessing it isn't going to do us any good. It's just, it's there, and it didn't do well.
It's there. Yeah. Oh.
2012, we get another success for Disney animation. Wreck-It Ralph, directed by Rich Moore, written by Phil Johnston, Jennifer Lee, with story by Rich Moore, Phil Johnston, and Jim Reardon. A concept that actually a lot of people aren't aware of this. I wasn't aware of this until I did the research. Has been bumping around Disney since the 80s.
Oh, I did not know that either.
Yeah, this was something that was first pitched during like the early Eisner era when he was trying to do some contemporary content. There was a pitch called High Score, and over the 90s and into the early 2000s, it had names like Joe Jump and Reboot Ralph, and there were concepts that kind of shifted all during this like never-ending development, and eventually it came out. And I think it's a pretty big success, and I think it's, one of the times we get to see here, we see this over and over and over again with Disney projects that an idea pops up, 30 years prior and then eventually does happen. Disney never lets go of an idea. Even Tangled had been discussed 20 years before it came out. And that's one of like the smaller amounts of time that something is bumping around the studio.
If you look online, and I'm sure we'll have another episode on this too, about all these abandoned projects Disney have, and a lot of them are still kind of bumping around within the studio, such as People of the Sun, which became like Emperor's New Groove, and other movies like that. They even have a Don Quixote film apparently somewhere in the works, but that could mean a million different things.
Yeah, there's a lot. There's a lot going on for a lot of years, and they'll still pull old concepts and concept. It's really interesting way to work. I think it's benefited them over the years. Wreck-It Ralph is cool because in a lot of ways, Wreck-It Ralph is Disney Animation Studios recognizing the success of Pixar-type storytelling, but they still do stick with pretty Disney traditional design for the characters that they are designing.
But they do adapt them in really interesting ways too. Like Wreck-It Ralph and Fix-It Felix are very like square because they're supposed to be based on pixels, which I really like. And there's a lot of like cubic design within them, which I think is really interesting. And then you compare them to the other arcade game that comes in where, it's kind of mocking of Halo and everything, and they're bulkier. Even like when you see Sonic and Bowser within the film, they're rounder, softer than, the older school designs, which is what I really like. There's a lot of attention to details, and it feels like it was made by somebody that likes and plays video games, which is not something you could say about a lot of video game films.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that Wreck-It Ralph is the closest thing we're ever going to get again to Who Framed Roger Rabbit. There's Nintendo characters on screen with Warner Brothers' own characters, with Capcom own characters, with whoever owns Qbert. I don't know. I think what's really interesting, too, there's a couple of really specific things in it that I think are great. First of all, this is the only time we're ever going to see a Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter crossover, I think. Also, we have a Disney version of Kano. Kano exists in a Disney movie in Wreck-It Ralph. Like, just put that through your head. I think Smoke is there, too, if I remember correctly.
And Bison's there, too.
Right. But you see, like, even, like, Street Fighter, part of my brain is like, okay, I can see that in a Disney franchise. We have Disney Mortal Kombat in this movie. We were talking about this where maybe Tangled starts this sort of self-awareness of Disney. This sort of starts the self-awareness of Disney, even in context with other entertainment, because, you have the characters who are from that very, like, Halo, Call of Duty-esque game running around. And, 2012, that was the biggest game on the planet. I think it may not age well in the sense you're going to have kids who don't recognize what it's referring to, but I think it's a strong enough movie to survive anyway. And I think it's so well put together that all of the sort of contemporary image is to when it was aren't going to have as much of an impact as one might think.
Right, I would agree with that. I do like the point you made earlier about kind of like taking influence from Toy Story, and that they kind of build like, you know, a lot of what Toy Story was in the 90s is not super relevant to kids today.
Right.
But it's still watched today because they build kind of like a familiar and still intricate world. And they do that with Wreck-It Ralph as well, just by like having the home, quote unquote, be within the power strip. Them being within the power strip and kind of building a world within this film that's kind of recognizable to anybody, even if they haven't really been to an arcade. They kind of recognize the things outside of that.
Right, and it's that building those characters that you care about that matters. You know, in 2020, kids don't think about the difference between their somewhat more expensive, violent action figures that they probably don't really even have compared to the old, you know, fun dolls that used to have like pull strings. Like that was very much something that was to connect with the audience in 1995. Wreck-It Ralph, I think, is strong enough characters where you could continually tell stories about them without the specific context of the original movie.
Yeah, we'll get into that in the sequel. I disagree a little bit, but
I know what you're going to be getting at with the sequel, and I think I agree with you a little bit, but I think the characters are strong enough.
yeah, they are. You can do a lot with, like, they're simple enough characters. You can see them in any situation, much like Rapunzel, the characters from Tangled and everything.
You know, so 2012 is a good year for Disney. 2013 is going to be probably the year for Disney out of, I don't know, since 1994. 2013 would see the debut of Frozen, directed by Chris Buck, Jennifer Lee. Screenplay by Jennifer Lee, story by Chris Buck, Jennifer Lee, Shane Morris, with songs by Robert Lopez, Kristen Anderson Lopez, and a score by Christoph Beck. Budget of $150 million that produces a box office of $1.28 billion. Frozen, as maybe are able to figure out if you don't have any context for it, is loosely based off of Hans Christian Andersen's The Ice Queen. Disney starts working on an Ice Queen portion of a Hans Christian Andersen movie in 1940 that gets scrapped as MGM moves on without them to create the Hans Christian Andersen movie with Danny Kaye, which is a pretty great film. Concept of doing the Ice Queen bounces around the studios from that point on. We were talking about this before. Disney does not drop ideas that they think can work. It gets another serious look during the 90s to be another feature film in that big era, but gets scrapped around 2002 in that form. Supposedly that has to do with Glenn Keane leaving to work on Rapunzel, which would become Tangled. Then in 2008, Lasseter convinces Chris Buck, who had done Tarzan in 99, to come back to the studio to start working on the Snow Queen. This is really where we start to see what will become Frozen come together. Even Josh Gad had been contacted around that point, but he said that it originally was going to be closer to the original story. One of the things that we forgot to mention before is we went from Rapunzel to Tangled. We're going from the Snow Queen to Frozen. There's kind of a specific reason for that. This all came out around the time of Tangled 2, that Disney felt that part of the reason The Princess and the Frog underperformed was because it had the princess in the title.
Yeah, I can kind of understanding the thinking here, because Princess of the Frog kind of called back to like a very traditional era, which is what people kind of didn't want in this era. I mean, this is kind of the era of Avatar and everything, and people were very much looking forward to like what could be over the horizon, you know, what could be on the screen, and not really looking back to like what has been on the screen.
Right. There's also this argument that was made that putting like the princess in the title kind of turned off male children from seeing it. I don't know how true that is.
There's a lot of like weird marketing things around it. There's like, oh, you know, it failed because it had princes in the title, so it turned off male viewers. It failed because it was a predominantly black cast, so it turned off other people. You know, I think it's just more generally, I think people did not want like a princess film, and they did not want this kind of weird modern retelling of The Princess and the Frog.
Yeah, I would agree. It was probably just bad timing culturally, but it does result in, we all know that executives like to latch onto success. So the fact that Tangled did well means that, you're not going to get the Snow Queen as a title. And so they go with Frozen, being that it's not really the Snow Queen at the point it hit screen anyway.
Yeah, it barely has anything to do with the original fairy tale at this point.
Yeah. The fairy tale is basically like a demon stealing children, which none of that is in the film. Director-writer Jennifer Lee has commented on this too, saying that it actually was extremely freeing because by the time they got on the project, Disney was so desperate to get anything out of this concept that they were really given like carte blanche with the story. Like they had to keep it like, obviously something that Disney could produce, but they really had a lot of freedom making this. Frozen becomes so huge in large part because of I wouldn't even want to say the score. I want to say because of Let It Go.
Yeah, I would agree with Let It Go. I also agree like the designs on it were really tight. The animation is really good. I do like Frozen. I know a lot of people are like fucking sick of this movie, and I don't blame them. I don't. I know like people's kids watch this movie like 5 times a day. I did that with The Lion King. But like I just think that Frozen is just generally a very, very good movie. There are some minor aspects I don't super like, and that's more to my general distaste for like pointing out tropes like lampshading, because a big part of this plot is with Anna being like, "Oh, I'm going to marry Hans," and everyone going, "You shouldn't marry Hans. That's not what rational people do. What
Right.
are you, some kind of Disney princess?" And they look at the camera.
Yeah, and I also think that if anything felt shoehorned in, it's Hans turning. Like, there's no indication.
No, but it was a good twist.
Okay, as a twist. I don't like. Okay, Frozen's fine. Like, I don't think it's an extremely good movie. I don't think it's as good as Tangled even. But I get that part of the point was to be aware of the audience and try to give the audience what they wanted. And it was a better version of that than maybe The Princess and the Frog was. The Princess and the Frog seemed to be reaching back too much almost, where, if you're going to do this type of story, trying to make it contemporary isn't really advancing it because you're not making that type of story then.
Yeah, I would agree to that because I think a lot of the appeal too is that Elsa's a very like not vague character, but you can kind of like slot any kind of emotional or mental problem you have into Elsa.
Right.
Because it's all about her hiding a secret, and that's kind of like weirdly relatable to like 99% of the population. And like things like Tiana overworking, that's relatable now, but it wasn't super relatable back then. And even with Rapunzel too, parental abuse is not super relatable, but it does make a very good plot, and I really like that. But I think the general success, you are right, is that this is a much more general audience film that people can kind of connect to more generally.
It continues into the song itself, Let It Go, where it is, you can really adapt that to anything that you want to adapt it to. And the fact that, you have Idina Menzel having that voice, singing that song, is going to cover all of the problems you have with it anyway.
Yeah, I think the score and even just Let It Go itself really like elevated this film. They took a lot of cues from Broadway, I feel like, and I think that's really what helped this film too. Is that it wasn't so traditionally film structured; it was more like Broadway structured.
Yeah, I would agree with that. There's definitely a focus on the music, and what's funny is as much as we sort of criticize The Princess and the Frog from trying to be too much like what came before, Disney paying attention to stage musicals is nothing new. I mean, there's always been the argument that part of their world is essentially just them taking a look at the best parts of the Little Shop of Horrors book and just making it into something that they could use a little better. And I think, there is a big influence of Wicked on Frozen in obvious ways and less obvious ways. But it's a formula that works, and I don't think there's anything really wrong with that when it comes down to it. Especially because Frozen's going to reach a different audience anyway, and there's no like blatant thievery of anything. They're looking at, hey, this is like kind of a cool way to do a musical. Why don't we see if this type of frame can work on the story that we're working on?
I do want to talk a little bit about the technology here too, because they did have to invent several techniques that would go later on into several other films, mostly with the snow and particle effects, because the way they animated the snow is that each little snowflake, they had to like individually animate that just so it could like look and feel right. And they would kind of bring that back into a much more coherent vision on later films. But this was kind of the beginning of them really pushing the standard of 3D animation, which was always Pixar's thing at this point, where Pixar was always the one being like, we're going to make really good 3D films and they're going to be really like technologically impressive. And this is kind of where you see the shift away from that for Pixar.
There was a deficit in quality in the prior decade between Walt Disney Studios 3D animation and Pixar, and it's around here. I would say even on Wreck-It Ralph, they start to close that gap to the point where I think it's effectively closed at this point. So Disney has this massive success with Frozen. Critically, it does well, but the financial success is overwhelming. It gets what? I think at least 2 re-releases, one with the sing-along version, which I think is telling. 2014, the next year, they release Big Hero 6, directed by Don Hall and Chris Williams, screenplay by Jordan Roberts, Robert L. Baird, and Dan Gerson. The genesis of this is probably the funniest thing I found in my research. Contrary to popular belief, apparently they are pretty open between the different divisions if someone isn't going to use a concept about letting another division take a look at it. Don Hall was encouraged, I guess, by Bob Iger to take a look at some of the stuff that Marvel wasn't really going to do anything with. He saw the name Big Hero 6, not knowing at all what it was, and was like, oh, that sounds cool. What's funny, though, is we do get a movie that base concept, not quite Big Hero 6, but we end up with a lot of the characters minus Sunfire and Silver Samurai, who I'm sure have been earmarked by Marvel Studios.
They were owned by Fox.
Oh, that's right. That would have all been... That's right. At this point, it still would have been under Fox because they're both X-Men characters. And probably... but I'm sure Kevin Feige was already like, when I get them back, you can't use them. And he would put the emphasis on when every time he said it.
And he has them back now.
Yeah, look what he did. Big Hero 6 is a cool movie, though. It plays off of, the familiarity of the public with superheroes now. Even in 2014, that had pretty much taken hold. It's really pretty. It's got a good story, and ends up winning the Academy Award for Best Animated Feature that year.
I don't know if it deserved Best Animator, but it is still a really good film. So I always thought Big Hero 6 was supposed to be like Disney's big attempt at like making a kind of crossover like Disney and Marvel film where, this was kind of be Marvel's entry point into like the Disney canon. That didn't really turn out to be the case at all. Big Hero 6 is relatively self-contained, surprisingly. But Big Hero 6 did surprisingly well, and it has this TV show coming out now. There is a 3rd season somewhere. Like everything now, it's kind of in limbo. And they did release some comic books around it. Big Hero 6, I do like quite a lot. And on the animation side of it, they did do several new lighting techniques, which would become a rendering software called Hyperion. Ooh. And pretty much every single Disney film after this would use this engine developed for this film.
Maybe that's where people are getting confused when they say he's going to show up in Multiverse of Madness. It's just the animation software. And they do get like their little Marvel hits in there. Stan Lee's in there. Orca is in there, which killed me. But a good movie. I think in a year that was maybe a little bit stronger for animation, might not have come home with the Academy Award. But you know what? It was good work, and it's nice to see them win. 2015 ends up with an empty year for Disney Animation Studios. There are some theories that this has to do with the problems with the first release of 2016, which was Zootopia. Directed by Byron Howard, Rich Moore, screenplay by Jared Bush and Phil Johnston, and story by Byron Howard, Rich Moore, Jared Bush, Jim Reardon, Josie Trinidad, Phil Johnston, and Jennifer Lee. That's a notably large amount of writers to be credited. Not necessarily a large amount of writers in reality, But in my research, this is one of the first movies that I saw them discuss something that they call the Disney Brain Trust, where all of the studios kind of get together and talk to each other, even if they're not in control of the production, and try to help each other out. Zootopia had kind of a rough development in that sense. The idea was around for a long time. There was a version of this script that would have basically been about predators being oppressed by these like control collars. Basically, a bunch of notes came back from all the different divisions, which I assume is where the story by credits are coming from, to kind of craft it into something more manageable. This original version of it was also more focused on Nick Wilde instead of Judy Hopps. A lot of those notes apparently came from Pixar staff to kind of shift that around and make the story a little more accessible. I like Zootopia, and Zootopia does insane money. Zootopia makes $1.24 billion on a budget of $150 million. I think it's kind of awkward, though. It starts off with a very distinct analogy for racism, and then as the movie kind of improves, like pacing-wise and tone-wise, it gets funnier, but you're still kind of going back to like how harsh that analog they're creating is.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think the metaphor gets messy towards the end when they do that, I guess, kind of now typical plot twist in Disney movies.
There's definitely this like kind of 80s action movie feel to Zootopia.
Where it's like, oh, well, I'm not going to spoil it.
We can spoil it. We're spoiling, folks.
All right,
yeah,
spoil.
A lot of one-liners. There's a twist near the end where the crafty fox, Nick Wilde, pulls one over on the villainous. With that, we can not spoil that, I guess, on the villain, and it's kind of out of nowhere and very like silly 80s action movie. Like, how the hell would anyone know that type twist?
There's a problem like with the metaphor with racism earlier, because that's where it really gets kind of messy with the theme. But throughout most of that film, like, it's pretty finely crafted with like the world and like with a lot of the themes at that point.
Yeah, it is. It's because I think I understand the intention of it. The intention of it was not to make any one of the animals like the central focus of the racism. The problem is it becomes like really bizarre and all over the place as it goes, because you're not really sure what the commentary is anymore. It starts off where it's like, oh, the prey animals are, always downtrodden and the predators are on top. And then they do introduce the idea that the predators are kind of miscast as, being overly aggressive, but then some of them are. And it's just this, like, it ends up kind of having no message outside of a very simple, like, sort of, don't judge people until you know them. But it seems like it's going for something deeper really early on, and it just never really accomplishes it.
Yeah, it's it's complicated, because I think, like, generally the bigger animals have more control over the smaller animals, because, like, a lot of the police officers are, like, predators, but then the guy that runs the police department is a giant ox.
Yeah, but he's giant. Yeah, it gets real, like, I guess it is, like, ultimately the way they probably went in their head was like, all right, this is too complicated. The message is just don't judge anyone.
Yeah, I think they had to scale it back at that point.
Yeah.
And I can kind of see why there's so many writers on this, and a lot of familiar writer names on it, like we were saying earlier, from previous films.
Right, and I think that's the big thing to notice is, like, there's very clearly an established group here who are monitoring this brand. They are making sure that Disney feels like Disney.
It does feel like a Disney movie, even though it pulls away from like the Princess formula, which has been kind of working for them pretty recently, and goes straight into like furry movies.
Yeah, and I think this is a good point to talk about that too. Like, it seems like there's two very distinct types of movies being produced by Walt Disney Animation, which are your very traditional, anchor film, fantasy princess films, if you want to call them that. I always lean towards fantasy because I never even felt like they were princess films. Like, I get that they're the main characters, and I get they've turned Disney Princess into a brand, but like, as a kid, I didn't perceive it that way, and I think still at this point, I don't really. It's just sort of the fantasy films that are the anchor films for Disney. And then there's like the secondary film, which tend to be more actiony and a little goofier. And I think that's what we're seeing here is, Big Hero 6, Zootopia, Wreck-It Ralph are these sort of secondary action films in a lot of ways, while those anchor fantasy films still exist.
Because it is interesting to kind of see the shift from like 90s Disney movies, like Aladdin, Lion King, Mulan. Like you wouldn't really think of any of those as princess movies, right? But they're kind of marketed like that now. It is interesting to see that, like, but now when they do these kind of princess movies, which is, like you said, a brand in of itself, there's a lot of like fantasy elements of it. Like Rapunzel has magic hair that restores life. Elsa has ice power, shit like that.
And I think they were going for this alternative film in the late 90s, early 2000s too. You get stuff like Atlantis. I think this is what they wanted to do for a very long time, and they've kind of figured out how to do it, which is why they're probably controlling it through the sort of brain trust is, hey, this is working. This didn't work before. We have to make sure it keeps working. But Zootopia, like I said, humongous success. Until researching this, I didn't even know how big it was. I knew it did well, but pretty incredible. Zootopia is followed in 2016 by Moana, directed by Ron Clements and John Musker, story by Chris Williams, Don Hall, Pamela Rabon, Aaron Candell, Jordan Candell, Ron Clements, John Musker, with songs from Lin-Manuel Miranda, Opataya Feoi. I think I got that. Feoi. Mark Mancino also on that score. This is another of these anchor fantasy films. Very organic development through Disney is from what I read in the early 2000s. Basically, they just thought it would be cool to explore these Pacific legends and came up with a script.
There's an interesting theory Lindsay Ellis from YouTube has. Lindsay Ellis being a kind of film critic. She points out that Moana kind of comes out around the same time as the Polynesian Disney Resort comes out. And there's kind of a weird cross promotion with that. But Disney always had like an inclination to kind of expand outside of like European fairy tales and kind of adapt these more like Eastern, even like indigenous fairy tales. And the first attempt was Pocahontas, which is kind of a disaster culturally.
Yeah, in that sense.
And Moana was like, they took a very concerned attempt as like talking to indigenous people and being like, what is the culture like? Putting in like cultural references into the film and making sure it does well by the film. But it does kind of come out of that kind of weird Disney cross branding we really see now, where it's like, well, there's a Polynesian resort, let's make a Polynesian princess movie, and then we can put her in the Polynesian resort and the kids will come.
To be fair, though, Polynesian like imagery and mythology has been a big part of Disney parks and even like smaller level productions for a long time. I think, while I think she's probably right that they intentionally timed it like dead on, I would say that making it sound like the only reason this movie exists is a little silly, considering how much of that culture they've used in all sorts of productions in the past.
No, yeah, that's absolutely true. Like, it's not just because of the hotel. It is because they're trying to appeal to like a global market now. Like, even back when Princess of the Frog was coming out, like the market wasn't as big as it is now.
Right.
Like, we have a huge market in China, across the world, India, all these other places, and Moana was kind of Disney's attempt to take a really like concise stab at that market, while also getting in some like small cross promotion and things like that. Like this didn't just come out just because of a hotel.
That should be our tagline for this episode. This didn't come out just because of a hotel. Moana, I think, I'll say, just a little opinion here, easily my favorite of the last decade.
Oh, really?
I think it's great. I love the music in it, and with Lin-Manuel Miranda in there, I shouldn't be shocked. I think The Rock as Maui is genius casting. I think that character is it understands what made the Disney Renaissance work without directly revisiting it. Like doing something different with it, but getting like where you should be getting your comedy from. And I also think it's really good action and it's very pretty. Like the big monster at the end of the film, I think is one of the coolest things they've ever done. And especially if you're watching it, either on the big screen or a good television that can get those like nice black levels, like it is just pretty.
Yeah, like the way they like the animated the water like really well. Like I was kind of worried about this film going into it because it seemed like there's a lot of like just being on a boat. And being on the boat is usually the worst arc of any like film or TV show. But they did surprisingly well with it, where they were able to kind of like build out the banter between Moana and Maui, where they really build out character development and really build like a really interesting relationship between them. And you are right, like that final scene with the lava titans, really, really beautiful. Like they really went out with this film. And it is surprisingly like catchy. Like a lot of the songs are so really catchy. I don't think they're as catchy as Frozen, but that's like a really tall order to get. And I think them getting Miranda into this kind of lends credence to the Broadway theory I was talking about earlier.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And he's continuing to work with them as well. Yeah, I agree. I actually think that, and I know that there's going to be millions of people who don't agree with me. I think How Far I'll Go is as good as Let It Go, but that's taste. Bring it.
Before we do move on, I do want to point out that there's something like an interesting trend kind of forming within these films at this point, is that there's not really like a villain within these princess films. Like Frozen and Moana don't really have a villain to fight, unlike like the 90s Disney films where they had like Ursula or Jafar or Scar or things like that.
Yeah, I think that, and that's, part of like a lot of the message of a lot of the films is that, Moana's about misunderstanding. Frozen's about misunderstanding. There are things to fight. There are villains within the stories, but they're not what needs to be triumphed over to fix the problem.
Right.
I guess is sort of the way it goes. That's, let's be honest, that's not too dissimilar from 60s Marvel villains either. That your villains aren't necessarily evil. You just might not understand what's going on.
No, it's alcoholism.
It's alcohol. That they won't. No, Disney doesn't do that. Remember, that was supposed to be Iron Man 2. That didn't work out. But yeah, I would agree with that. There isn't these distinct villains that you're always going to play as villains. It's more of general problems that have to be solved.
Right, like it's eternal like emotional problems. Even where like Wreck-It Ralph has like a villain, he doesn't really become the villain until like the last like maybe 15 minutes.
Right.
Or like Zootopia, like you don't get a villain until like the last like 20 minutes.
But in Zootopia, you do get a villain, and I think that's part of, like we were saying, there is this sort of two distinct types of movies they're putting out, where it's the more action-y one, where you maybe do get that villain, and then those big fantasy princess films, where it's grand ideas and musical numbers, which is great. Like, look, it needs, like, that's important. That's cool to have those movies around. I would have been really disappointed if, this changeover to Iger led to just more of them trying to be hip and cool.
Right, yeah. And I mean, there's still a little bit of that in Moana. Like I said, Maui makes a reference about, I hope you don't start singing like it's some kind of like princess, like that makes.
But he also
that always makes me lose my eye.
So like it kind of counterpoints. And he sings like what I think is one of the funniest songs I've ever done.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yeah. Because that's poking fun at the fact that you have these figures in mythology who did everything. But Moana, decent success. There's a debate over how much it costs. We'll go with the high number, $175 million budget. Box office of $690 million. A little higher than that. But still a success.
So in 2017, John Lasseter announces that he will be leaving. Originally, he announces it as a 6-month absence that he'd be taking from this Disney studio. And John Lasseter is the guy, like we were saying earlier, that ushered in the new Disney era. And the reason he does leave is because he had several sexual misconducts levied against him from within the company, from employees. You can read several of these stories within, but he would make often sexual suggestive comments to employees and writers and things like that. people described him as like a kid, like almost like a teenager, and he would just like make a lot of sex jokes at people. So he leaves the company. He originally, like I said, is a 6 month absence. It's starting in November 2017, but then he actually leaves the company in June 2018, and he would be replaced by Jennifer Lee, who did Frozen and a lot of these other new Disney era films. And she's still early in her position.
That's a really like kind of cool story. I mean, the Lasseter thing is unfortunate, but her getting a position. I mean, this is someone who worked on 2 films that broke $1 billion.
Right, and she's the first female director to break $1 billion, which is insane in of itself.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. And she seems, from a lot of the research I did for this, and I'm sure you did too, seems like an incredibly talented creator and someone who you want in a position like that.
Around now, we would be actually seeing like the film she would probably be presiding over, but we probably won't see that until next year with this quarantine.
Well, that's okay. We got 2 more years to talk about before we even get to now.
Yeah.
2018 would see the release of the first of 2 sequels from Walt Disney Animation. Ralph Breaks the Internet, the sequel to Wreck-It Ralph, directed by Rich Moore and Phil Johnson, screenplay by Phil Johnson and Pamela Rabon, and story by Rich Moore, Phil Johnson, Jim Reardon, Pamela Rabon, and Josie Trinidad. Once again, we're seeing this brain trust kick in. Does pretty well, $175 million budget, makes $529 million at the box office. It's a very interesting movie. I can't say I dislike it because I don't. I actually think the first half of it is really cool. I think it loses its own plot as it goes forward. Like, they should have maybe shot for an hour and a half version of the first half of the movie instead of an hour and 45-minute version with this sort of bizarre ending where they introduce a villain once again really late in the game. But it got a lot of criticism for a lot of the big corporations that show up in it as Ralph and Vanellope, not Penelope, like I wanted to say. As they're traveling through the internet, they're kind of seeing the internet for the first time, so they see all these different apps and things. I kind of liked that. I didn't have a problem with it. I thought, how the hell else are you going to do that?
Yeah, no, I like broadly, like you were saying, I kind of like it in principle. And like we were saying with Wreck-It Ralph, like these characters are kind of well defined enough that you can do another movie. I do like the arc of Vanellope kind of being bored with the same game over and over again and constantly winning. And I do like the idea that Ralph kind of wants things to stay the same because he's comfortable where he is. I mean, he's been doing the same thing since the 80s. He likes it. But it does lose me once I actually get into the internet, and the plot is that Ralph has to like twerk to make money because it can make money off of memes to buy new controller for Vanellope's arcade machine.
I'm okay with that as like the solution to the problem, and but you're right. Like, it's not the most interesting thing in the movie. I mean, the most talked about thing in that movie is the fact that you have them essentially go to like a Disney fan site and
Yeah,
they run into like everything from Disney, which I thought was really cool. And I thought we were talking about this before, this idea of being able to be self-referential without like making fun of yourself too much, where you're like demeaning your own brand. I thought they did a really great job of that with the princesses in it, because it's more of this sort of Wreck-It Ralph, even the first one, is based on all of these bizarre rules that you make up, like how this world works. And the way they portray the princesses in it, where there are many of them show up, is that's the way their world works. Like, to get things done, they're the heroes, and they got to sing songs, and they got to figure out what they really believe in. And like, I thought that was kind of cool, actually.
I would have liked it if they actually stuck with because they abandoned it. It feels like pretty quickly. Like it's like a 10-minute sequence where they're in like the Disney headquarters website, and I do laugh at the way they get there. They like talk to the Google bot and like take us to the coolest website around.
Yeah,
And it's Disney.com. And it's like God, wow, you're shameless.
But it's also almost that like Bill and Ted sense of humor where it's like, you know what we're doing, just enjoy it.
Well, yeah, I would have been fine with it. They kept doing that, but then they kind of retreat back to like Ralph twerking on like Vine
Yeah.
or
And there's the bizarre like end game thing of it where he creates like a virus of himself. Like it doesn't fit with the rest of the movie. It's just strange.
Yeah. And then there's even that plot about like the GTA Online that Penelope really wants to be a part of, which like I like that idea of like them going to
Right.
online games like Fortnite or GTA 4 or whatever. Like I think that would have been a really cool like movie concept in and of itself, but it gets really like bogged down by memes.
And I agree with that. I think that like that stuff, the stuff where they're dealing with the Disney website, the stuff that they're seeing the internet, the stuff where they're in GTA Online, like if that had been the focus of that third act, I think I would have loved this movie. But it's as the movie goes, it just like loses focus on what's making it interesting, which
Right,
the
yeah.
first one didn't do. The first one was interesting like top to bottom. And I think, like as you were talking about before, like these are characters that can be transitioned to other things. I think that ending was like almost demeaning to those characters, where like we didn't need like a fake mob boss computer virus guy in that movie. Like the movie could have just been about them struggling with the idea that, Vanellope doesn't want to go back to the game. How cool would it have been if like you get to the movie and like the end of the second act, they've already resolved what you think is the main plot, and now it's just this chaos created by all these things you've seen.
Right, like I like Vanellope kind of reminds me of what they tried to do with Stitch in the early 2000s, where Stitch was kind of like this chaotic character, can kind of like go into any franchise and kind of like muck it up. And
Yeah,
I felt
like
like that's what they were doing with Vanellope here, but then they pull back from that and make her like part of the Disney princess canon. And like
yeah.
in any of these features films, this is the first time you saw all the like quote unquote Disney princesses together, and that was supposed to be like a big moment.
And the gags were funny. Like that sequence is fine.
Yeah.
Like the whole thing where like Ariel starts singing about t-shirts like killed me.
They should have had
But
Miss Piggy in there though, within the Disney princesses.
oh man, well I think that like the nod to Brave was like as far as we were gonna get with that, which I think is smart. The fact that they kind of were like, oh, she's from a different studio, like doesn't really count. Like I thought that was 2019, we get the second of our big sequels here. Frozen 2, directed by Chris Buck, Jennifer Lee, holding strong. Screenplay by Jennifer Lee and Chris Buck. And story by Jennifer Lee and Marquis Smith, Kristen Anderson Lopez, and Robert Lopez. So pretty much the same crew. We got songs from Robert Lopez and Kristen Anderson Lopez. Christoph Beck on that score. In development since apparently around like 2014. Disney's pretty good about keeping things locked down on that. They announced in 2015 that it would be happening.
Right. This kind of feels like one of those films kind of stuck in production hell because there's a million different ideas in it and none of them get developed.
It's also an intimidating film. Like how do you follow that up? Like how do you decide like what to do? I'm going to put it out there. I think Frozen 2 is a better movie than Frozen on the whole. I really like how sort of high adventure it starts to get. This is really about, Elsa finding out why she has powers now that she's comfortable with it. Also breaks $1 billion, $150 million budget, which is a little surprising. That's a little low compared to what we've heard. But, those are all speculative. With $1.45 billion box office. Like I said, I think the plot's a lot stronger. I think it's a lot more interesting. I think all the problems I really had with Frozen, as far as that goes, are fixed in Frozen 2. Doesn't have that breakout song. They try to go for 2 in it for showstoppers. But I think it's a really good movie. And I think it does a very difficult thing, which is take what is a big, like anchor film for the year and get a sequel to it that doesn't seem like an insult or like a cash-in.
I think there's like so much going on that it gets like really confusing and bogged down by its own ideas. Like Elsa gets like 5 different animal pets. Like she has the wind ball, she has the little lizard, she gets the water horse. There's like the rock gnomes and everything. And
See, I don't. That doesn't bother me because I think like to me like it's almost like Odyssey. Like it's kind of a series of like, okay, we're trying to get to this goal, and here are all the little things we have to do to get there, which I like. Like I think that's cool.
But for me, it felt like, this is going to be another toy. This is going to be another toy. It's kind of felt like when I first watched The Force Awakens, like, this is going to be like another book series. This is going to be another like TV show. It's just like gesturing a lot of different ideas and never like fleshing any of them out. Even like the songs too, like Into the Unknown is almost like beat for beat, Let It Go.
Right. It's not, and I don't think they're trying to like. I don't think anyone's trying to hide that. And you're right. There is the sort of the more toyetic feel to it. I still think it was really cool. I don't know. I just really liked it.
I agree with you in that it's like it's really cool to look at in the sense like there's a lot of like animation techniques that are in that are like really fascinating and like a lot of the designs in it are like really cool. Like even like Elsa's new designs are like really interesting. Like the like kind of weird I guess like bodysuit. It almost looks like an X-Men thing.
Yeah, and I
like
think that's intentional. She does become very superhero-y in this one, which, you know, is, hey, sign of the times, right? And that's where we end. Pixar did have a 2020 release, and Onward, we're not going to talk about that because, once again, not Walt Disney Animation Studios. And I think we will revisit Pixar if you guys like this episode. I think we can run a lot of parallels, really create like a very complete view of what was going on. But this was really to pinpoint Walt Disney Studios as a studio in the last 10 years. I think we can talk right now and kind of go forward from is Disney Plus. Disney Plus has opened the floodgates of access to these films for a lot of kids and films that come before it. I kind of talked about this a little bit before. I think the biggest effect of Disney Plus is going to be doing something that Disney has done very successfully over the years is they take their failures, however you want to define that, and 10 years later, they're a success. I think we're going to have kids obsessed with Princess and the Frog. I think they're going to be kids obsessed with Home on the Range, and it's all going to fold into Disney.
I don't know about Home on the Range, but I I do see it with like
some kid out there doesn't like it.
That's their prerogative.
Do you get what I'm saying there? Like that Disney has created such a strong brand that they've shown that like nothing dies, even like ideas in the studios don't die. I think that Disney Plus is like changes the game on what their back catalog is. And then because they've been so strong for a decade now, a lot of things are going to be revisited. That happened, you know, in earlier films. Like Pinocchio didn't do well in theaters. It's considered like a classic now. Why? Because it took time for people to build and appreciate it.
True. You say that, but then like Black Cauldron is still nowhere to be seen. It's like in some black hole.
Cauldron looked different because Black Cauldron was like castrated in the middle of production and like didn't get the distribution it should have and was in like a really dark time.
Yeah. But I generally, yes, I do agree with you that there's like, even now you see people come out and say like, Treasure Planet is like a brilliant movie. Atlantis is a brilliant movie. Things like that. Like you see a lot of people like being able to revisit these older films and like really see them and earnestly love them.
And because the brand is so strong now, you're going to have people, you know, like the problem with being really interested in all this stuff is you forget that there are people who aren't, as weird as that sounds. There are plenty of people who right now are just seeing Disney as a strong brand. They've got this streaming service that they love, and they're going to watch anything they want to watch on it. They're not going to have this feeling of like, oh, this movie bombed. They're going to watch this movie and be like, oh, that was cool. And the next time they go to Disney World, they're going to want a t-shirt. And like Disney's able to make success out of failure over and over again. And I think this past decade, this like new Disney decade, has brought back that power in a way that it hasn't appeared in the past.
Well, I think it's more like the fans are able to turn the bombs into successes because Disney usually once it bombs, they don't do much to really promote it anymore. You kind of saw that with The Princess and the Frog.
They kind of like that groundswell. Yeah. And then they're going to jump on it.
Yeah. Once there's like the grassroots movement to like really bring it up, you do really see them jump on it again, but it's from like bottom up.
And that comes from the fact that, for the most part, and I think maybe that like 5-year period, like 2000 to 2005, maybe you can't say this as much, but there is a level of quality that kind of runs through everything. Even those films, you know, like Chicken Little's not bad. It's just not all that interesting. Like it's, and I think, you know, that's something that's really helpful because, you know, if you go on to Disney Plus and you watch a Disney feature animated film, it's not going to be a miserable experience, except for maybe Home on the Range for you. I don't know.
It's bizarre. I
think I'm going to like rewatch that tonight just because we've been talking about it so much. I don't think I saw it since it came out. But that really brings us to where we are with Disney. Like I said, guys, like this one, we're especially interested. Comment. Let us know what you're thinking. Do you want to talk about other Disney films? Do we want to talk about Pixar as a topic? This is like, we're opening this door intentionally.
Yeah, because this
We are, because love is an open door.
But this is a weird era because like we said, John Lasseter kind of just left, and the last two movies were kind of like from his era. Like when a movie goes into production, it's like a production for 2 years. So these like last two films were not overseen by like Jennifer Lee or anything. I mean, they were like in post production, but like they were brainstormed by that John Lasseter crew, that John Lasseter posse. So we're in the middle of a transitionary period, especially with Disney Plus, like we were pointing out earlier.
Yeah, I think the transition's probably already done. We just haven't seen it. I think we're in a new era, and I think with this basis, they're on really strong feet. But like we said, like we love talking about Disney stuff. If this is something you guys want to hear us talk about more, let us know. I think that's really it with the Disney for today. You can find us on pretty much any social media if you want to comment there. We did briefly have a TikTok, but it was irritating. It was like I felt like I was in internet hell running the TikTok, so that doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah, you're posting your huge collection.
Yeah, I have a big action figure collection, which might come up on some other projects too. But we are all around. Just type in Dissecting Fiction, you'll find us. You found this podcast somehow, so we're on most major podcast platforms. We do want to give shout outs still going on to all this. ToyStoreGuide.com doing their best to promote a lot of independent toy stores who really need your patronage right now. Same thing with any comic book shops, any of these businesses that really cannot get to their customers as easily. Check out their websites. Most of them are doing something to make sure they can get product out to you. Hopefully this will not be the state of things for too much longer. And once again, comment, like, subscribe, do all the good things you possibly can for us. But I think that brings us to the end of the show. I'm Vinny Murphy.
I'm Christiaan Cutler.
And thanks for listening.